This content is AI generated for informational purposes only and should not be directly used for clinical decision-making.
Hello and welcome back to the Neurosurgery Hub podcast. I'm Dr. Eris, Senior Attending Neurosurgeon.
And I'm Dr. Alara, Research Fellow. Today we're looking at a fascinating new study from the Journal of Korean Medical Science, published in 2026. The title is Single-Fraction Stereotactic Radiosurgery for Benign Perioptic Meningiomas, a strategy for long-term tumor control and radiation-induced optic neuropathy avoidance with a 10-year follow-up.
This is a crucial topic, Alara. When we talk about perioptic meningiomas, or POMs, we are always walking a tightrope. On one side, we want total tumor control, but on the other, we have the optic apparatus, or the OA, usually defined as the optic nerves and chiasm. If we're too aggressive with our radiation dose, we risk radiation-induced optic neuropathy, or RION. If we're too conservative, we see the tumor grow back.
Exactly. And what makes this study by Lee and colleagues particularly valuable is the follow-up duration. Most studies give us 3 to 5 years of data, but this team from Seoul National University Hospital looked at 30 patients with a median follow-up of 152 months. That's over 12 years of data.
That's a significant time frame for benign meningiomas. We know these tumors can be slow-growing, so a 5-year success might actually be a 10-year failure. Let's dive into the methodology. Who were these patients?
The inclusion criteria were strict. They only included patients who underwent single-fraction stereotactic radiosurgery, SRS, specifically using Gamma knife, where the tumor was less than 2 millimeters from the optic apparatus. They excluded anyone with less than 10 years of follow-up.
A 2-millimeter gap is essentially direct contact once you factor in the steep dose gradients of the Gamma knife. How did they handle the planning?
They used 3D volume isotropic turbospin echo sequences to contour the OA. For patients with functional vision, their rule of thumb was to keep the maximum dose to the optic apparatus, the Dmax, below 8 gray. The prescription dose was usually delivered at the 50% isodose line. On average, the gross tumor volume, or GTV, was about 4.8 cubic centimeters.
And what was the actual doses delivered to the tumors?
The mean dose delivered to the GTV was 12.7 gray. However, because they were trying to protect the optic nerve, the coverage rate, the percentage of the tumor actually receiving the prescription dose, was relatively low, averaging 76.7%. The D98%, which represents the dose to nearly the entire tumor volume, was only 7.0 gray.
That D98% is quite low for a meningioma. We usually like to see higher doses for long-term control. What did the results show regarding tumor stability?
This is where it gets sobering. The actuarial 5-year progression-free survival, or PSS, was quite good at 90%, but when they reached the 10-year mark, the PSS dropped to 70%. Overall, they only achieved tumor control in 57% of the patients.
That is a massive drop-off between years 5 and 10. It highlights exactly why short-term data is misleading in perioptic cases. Did they notice a pattern in when these treatments failed?
Yes, treatment failure occurred in a significantly delayed fashion. The average time to progression was 107 months, nearly 9 years after the Gamma knife procedure. Some patients didn't show progression until 200 months post-SRS.
It's a slow-motion failure. Now, the paper identifies a specific statistical threshold for success regarding tumor coverage. Can you elaborate on that?
That was one of their key findings. They found that the coverage rate was the primary factor associated with long-term tumor control. Specifically, they identified a cutoff value of 81%. If the coverage was above 81%, the long-term control was significantly better. In many of their failure cases, they realized that parts of the tumor, like the dural tail or segments immediately adjacent to the OA, were intentionally omitted or underdosed to save the nerve.
Right. The safety margin for the nerve becomes the growth margin for the tumor. But let's talk about the other side of the coin, the visual outcomes. Did their conservative dosing actually succeed in preventing RION?
In terms of safety, the results were excellent. Among patients who retained valid vision, the mean Dmax to the optic apparatus was 7.2 gray. Not a single patient in the study developed radiation-induced optic neuropathy. No RION at all over 10 years.
0 RION is impressive, but we have to look at the functional cost. Did any patients lose vision for other reasons?
Yes, 2 patients suffered visual decline, but the study is clear that this was due to tumor progression, not radiation damage. These declines happened late, at 116 months and 103 months post-SRS.
This brings us to a very modern dilemma in neurosurgery. We are so afraid of causing RION that we might be undertreating these tumors, which then leads to the very blindness we were trying to avoid just a decade later.
Exactly. The author suggests that the fear of RION led to inadequate tumor coverage near the OA. Because the treatment failures were so delayed, the initial success of the SF-SRS masked the long-term risk of tumor-induced visual loss.
It's also worth noting how they re-evaluated their GTV. The paper mentions they revised the tumor contours for the study.
Right. They established a new GTV for their analysis because in the original plan, certain tumor portions or the dural tail were often omitted from the target. When they recalculated the dosimetric parameters using the true GTV, they could see more clearly why the failures occurred.
So, for the residents and fellows listening, if you're planning a gamma knife case for a perioptic meningioma, what is the takeaway? Do we just crank up the dose and risk the nerve?
The authors don't suggest being reckless, but they do emphasize that clarifying the optimal dose range is crucial. They found that keeping the OA dose low was safe for the nerve, but the resulting poor coverage, specifically below that 81% threshold, was the Achilles heel of the treatment.
It suggests we need to be more precise. Perhaps we need to utilize the steep dose gradients of modern gamma knife more effectively, or consider whether a single fraction is always the best approach for these direct contact cases. If you can't get 81% coverage without hitting the nerve with more than 8 to 10 gray, you might need a different strategy.
They also mention that surgical decompression remains a primary approach for cases in direct contact, especially to create that small gap needed for safer SRS later. But for residual tumors or patients who can't have surgery, we have to find that sweet spot.
This study really challenges the midterm data we've relied on. It tells us that for benign meningiomas, the finish line isn't at 5 years. If you're a practicing surgeon, you need to tell your patients that SF-SRS for POMS requires very long-term follow-up, well beyond a decade.
And that visual deterioration isn't just a side effect of radiation, it's a consequence of undertreatment. The study concludes that inadequate coverage near the optic apparatus, driven by concerns about RION, directly results in a significant incidence of long-term tumor progression.
It's a call for a paradigm shift in how we balance these risks. We need sustained tumor control to protect vision in the long run. Great summary, Alara.
Thank you, Dr. Aris. It's definitely a paper that will change how we look at our planning sessions tomorrow morning.
Absolutely. That's all for today's episode of the Neurosurgery Hub podcast. Join us next time as we continue to dissect the latest research in the field.
See you then.